Professor Vextal walked into the large classroom where students from 47 different alien species waited for her lecture to begin, and her crystalline scales caught the soft light, making them shimmer like precious stones, while her compound eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail of the diverse crowd before her, and she felt a familiar sense of pride knowing she was about to teach one of the most important lessons in xenobiology to these eager young minds who had traveled from all corners of the galaxy to learn from her, and her 73 cycles of teaching experience had made her one of the most respected professors in the entire Galactic Assembly, and today's topic was particularly close to her heart because it dealt with her own species and their unique place in the universe, and she took her position behind the podium with confidence and authority that came from decades of academic excellence and scientific research that had made her name known throughout civilized space. And she began speaking with her voice carrying clearly through the translation field that allowed every species present to understand her words in their own language and cognitive framework. And she said, "Today we will discuss one of the most fascinating topics in all of xenobiology, and that topic is the concept of death worlds and the species that evolve on them. And these are planets so dangerous and hostile that merely surviving there requires adaptations that go far beyond what normal evolution produces on safer worlds." And the students leaned forward with interest, because this was a topic that captured imagination and sparked curiosity among all species regardless of their own planetary origins. And some students shifted nervously while others made excited sounds that their translators conveyed as anticipation. And Professor Vexthal activated the holographic display above her podium, and suddenly a planet materialized in the air, spinning slowly, so everyone could see its hellish surface covered in volcanic activity and glowing with an eerie orange light that spoke of extreme heat and deadly conditions. And she said, "This is Xenthar Prime, and this is my homeworld, and my species evolved on this planet over millions of years, and the gravity there is 3 times what most species consider normal, and the temperature swings 200 degrees in a single day, and the atmospheric pressure would crush 98% of known species within minutes, and yet my people, the Xenthari, not only survived there but thrived and became the dominant intelligent species." And she paused, letting her words sink in while her tail swished behind her in a gesture that her students had learned meant she was making an important point. And she continued, saying that the Galactic Assembly has studied thousands of planets across hundreds of systems, and they have identified and classified countless worlds according to their habitability and danger levels, and after all this research and all these centuries of exploration and study, they have found only one true death world species, and that species is the Xenthari, and we are unique in the entire known galaxy because no other species has evolved under such extreme and deadly conditions, and our very biology represents the pinnacle of adaptation and survival. And our exoskeletons can withstand pressures that would kill others instantly, and our internal systems can regulate temperature through extremes that would cook or freeze normal beings, and we have redundant organs so that if one system fails, we can continue functioning, and we are simply put the only death world species in existence. And she said this with evident pride, because it was a distinction her people had held for 3 standard centuries, and it defined much of Xenthari culture and identity. And the students nodded and took notes and seemed to accept this as established scientific fact because Professor Vexthal was renowned for her accuracy and rigorous research methods, and she would never make claims without solid evidence to support them. And the lecture continued with detailed explanations of Xenthari physiology and the specific adaptations that allowed them to survive on such a hostile world, and she showed images of their redundant circulatory systems and their crystalline exoskeletons and their enhanced sensory organs and their ability to enter dormant states during the worst environmental extremes, and every piece of information reinforced the idea that Xenthari were special and unique and unmatched in their resilience and survival capabilities. And the students from softer worlds looked at the Xenthari professor with a mixture of awe and fear, realizing they were in the presence of a being whose very existence defied what they considered possible. And then something unexpected happened, and in the back row, partially hidden behind a tall, methane-breathing Volgan student, a hand slowly rose into the air. And the gesture was simple, but it carried significance because it meant someone wanted to speak. and Professor Vexthal paused mid-sentence and her scales shifted color slightly as she processed this interruption, and her translator took a moment to identify the gesture as a request to speak according to human customs, and she looked toward the back of the room and said, "Yes, Student Morrison. And do you have a question?" And a young human woman stood up and, her name was Kate Morrison, and she was 28 years old with auburn hair tied back practically, and green eyes that showed both respect and determination, and she was one of only 3 humans enrolled in this prestigious xenobiology program, and she wore the uniform of the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet, and she represented a species that had joined the Galactic Assembly only 5 years ago, and humans were still new and largely unknown to most of the established alien civilizations, and Kate took a breath, knowing that all eyes in the massive lecture hall had turned toward her and she could feel the weight of attention from dozens of different species. And she spoke clearly and respectfully, saying, "With all due respect, Professor Vexthal, but I believe there may be an error in your classification system." And the room went silent, and several students made sounds of disbelief, because challenging a Zenthari professor on matters of xenobiology was bold to the point of recklessness, and the Zenthari were known for their pride in their Deathworld heritage, and questioning such a fundamental aspect of their identity was simply not done. And Professor Vexthal's scales darkened to a shade that indicated skepticism mixed with slight offense, and she said, "An error, and please elaborate, Student Morrison, because the classification of Zenthar Prime as the galaxy's only true Deathworld has been verified and re-verified by the Assembly's leading xenobiologists for 300 standard years." And there was an edge in her voice that suggested this conversation might not go well for the young human who dared to question established scientific consensus. And Kate pulled out her datapad and synced it with the lecture hall's holographic system, and she said, "I do not dispute that Zenthar Prime is a Deathworld professor because your planet's conditions are indeed extreme by any measure. But I believe Earth should also be classified as a Deathworld." And the murmur that ran through the classroom was louder now, and some students actually laughed, and the Glorian exchange students rippled with what appeared to be amusement, because the idea that humans could be from a Deathworld seemed absurd to species who had already met humans and found them pleasant and friendly and not particularly intimidating. And Professor Vexthal's tail went rigid, and her scales darkened further, and she said, "Student Morrison, I appreciate human enthusiasm and your desire to make your species seem more impressive, but making exaggerated claims about your homeworld does not serve science." And Kate interrupted, saying, "I apologize for interrupting, Professor, but if you will allow me to present Earth's planetary data, I think you will find the classification is warranted and backed by solid evidence." And for a long moment the Zenthari professor simply stared at the human, and something in Kate's steady gaze and confident posture made her reconsider, and she made a gesture that might have been the Zenthari equivalent of a shrug and said, "Very well then, and proceed with your presentation. And let us examine these claims objectively and scientifically. And if you can prove your point, I will acknowledge it. And if you cannot, then this will serve as a lesson about making claims without proper evidence." And Kate nodded, and her fingers moved across her datapad, and the holographic display changed, and the hellish landscape of Zenthar Prime faded away and was replaced by an image of Earth spinning slowly in space with white clouds swirling over blue oceans and green and brown continents, and the planet looked beautiful and peaceful, and several students made appreciative sounds because Earth appeared to be a paradise compared to the volcanic nightmare of Zenthar Prime. And Kate began speaking, and she said, "Earth at first glance appears to be a garden world, and the average surface temperature is 15 degrees Celsius, and we have a breathable oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, and liquid water covers 70% of the surface. But these comfortable averages hide something much more dangerous." And she zoomed the display to show Earth's polar regions, and said our poles reach temperatures of -90 degrees Celsius and our deserts exceed 70 degrees, and that is a temperature variance of 160 degrees across the planet's surface. And these extremes exist simultaneously, not in cycles. And Professor Vexthal said, "Impressive. Variation, but hardly." And Kate cut her off, saying, "Earth experiences catastrophic weather phenomena on a regular basis." And she pulled up footage of a massive hurricane visible. Kate continued her presentation, while Professor Vexthal moved closer to the holographic display. and her scales had shifted from dark skepticism to a lighter shade that indicated genuine interest and curiosity. And the other students in the lecture hall had stopped their murmuring and were now watching intently as the human pulled up more data about Earth and its various dangers, and Kate brought up a map showing Earth's tectonic plate boundaries and said, "Our planet's crust is fractured into massive plates that constantly move and grind against each other, and this creates volcanic eruptions that can eject billions of tons of material into the atmosphere, and earthquakes that can release energy equivalent to hundreds of thermonuclear weapons, and we have something called the Ring of Fire around our Pacific Ocean that contains 75% of the world's active volcanoes and experiences 90% of our earthquakes." And she showed footage of a tsunami and a massive wall of water slamming into a coastline with devastating force and said, "Our oceans are in constant violent motion, and tides driven by our unusually large moon can vary by over 15 meters, and underwater earthquakes generate tsunami waves that cross entire ocean basins at 800 kilometers per hour and reach heights of over 30 meters when they hit land." And several students made sounds of shock because they were beginning to understand that Earth was not the peaceful garden world it appeared to be. And Professor Vexthal's scales had shifted to pale blue, which Kate had learned meant intense focus and scientific interest. And the professor said, "These are impressive environmental hazards, Student Morrison, but violent. Weather and geological activity, while noteworthy, do not necessarily create a death world classification, because it is the evolutionary pressure and resulting adaptations that truly matter. And Zenthar Prime's environment shaped my people into beings with exoskeletons that can withstand crushing pressure and internal temperature regulation that handles extreme fluctuations and redundant biological systems that ensure survival. And can you claim similar adaptations for humans?" And Kate nodded, because she had expected this challenge, and said, "I can, Professor. But first let me show you what humans evolved alongside." And the holographic display changed again, and now it showed a massive creature with powerful legs and a head full of teeth, each one the size of a human forearm. And Kate said, "This is a Tyrannosaurus rex, and it was one of Earth's apex predators from 65 million years ago, and it stood 6 meters tall and weighed 9 tons, and its bite force exceeded 60,000 newtons, which was strong enough to crush bone, and it was just one of thousands of species of large predatory dinosaurs that dominated Earth for over 160 million years." And she cycled through more images showing long-necked Brachiosaurus, and armored Ankylosaurus and pack-hunting velociraptors, and the alien students watched with growing horror, because they were seeing creatures that looked like something from their worst nightmares. And Kate said a cosmic impact event eliminated most of these large species, but it did not make Earth any safer, because the creatures that survived evolved to fill every ecological niche, and the competition only intensified. And she showed footage of a great white shark breaching the water, with its rows of serrated teeth clearly visible, and said, "Our oceans contain predators that have remained virtually unchanged for 400 million years, because their design is already perfect, and this shark can detect electrical impulses from other creatures' heartbeats and smell a single drop of blood in an Olympic swimming pool and bite, with a force of 18,000 newtons, and there was a collective intake of breath from the assembled students because they were beginning to understand that Earth's biology was as dangerous as its geology." And Kate continued showing them saltwater crocodiles that could remain motionless for hours before exploding into an attack with jaws that closed with 16,000 newtons of force, and polar bears that could smell prey from 30 kilometers away and run at 40 kilometers per hour despite weighing 800 kilograms, and venomous snakes and spiders and jellyfish and plants that could kill with a single touch. And the list went on, and Professor Vexthal was now completely focused on the presentation. And her initial skepticism had been replaced by genuine scientific fascination. And Kate said, "And these are just the large predators, because Earth's small organisms can be even more dangerous." And she showed microscopic images of bacteria and viruses, and said, "Our planet has developed diseases that can kill in hours or days, and bacterial infections, and viral hemorrhagic fevers, and parasitic organisms that reproduce inside living hosts, and before we developed modern medicine, half of all humans died from disease before reaching adulthood." And a student in the third row raised a tentacle nervously and said, "But surely, Student Morrison, Your species developed in isolation from such dangers and perhaps in a safer region of your planet. And Kate smiled grimly and said, "No, we evolved directly in the midst of all this. And in fact, humans evolved in one of the most dangerous regions of Earth, which is the African savanna." And she showed images of rolling grasslands dotted with acacia trees, and it looked peaceful until she added overlays showing the various predators that inhabited the region, and lions, and leopards, and hyenas, and wild dogs and elephants and buffalo and hippopotamus, which despite being herbivores killed more humans than any predator, and venomous snakes and disease-carrying insects. And the list continued, and she said humans evolved as persistence hunters, and we could not outrun our prey or our predators because nearly every large animal on Earth is faster than we are, and we could not outfight them because we lack natural weapons like claws or fangs or armor, and instead we evolved something different, which was endurance and intelligence, and she brought up anatomical diagrams of human physiology, and said our bodies are designed for marathon running, and we can regulate our temperature through sweat, which most species cannot do efficiently, and we can maintain a steady pace for hours or sometimes days, and we outlast prey animals that are faster, but overheat quickly, and our ancestors would literally chase antelope until the animal collapsed from exhaustion, and then kill it, and eat it. And Professor Vexthal leaned even closer to the display examining the human skeletal structure and said, "Fascinating, because your species appears almost fragile compared to apex predators with no natural armor and relatively weak bite force and no claws, so how did you become dominant?" And Kate replied simply saying tools and social cooperation, because humans are pack hunters and we work in coordinated groups and communicate complex strategies and use weapons to compensate for our physical limitations, and a single human might die facing a large predator, but 10 humans with spears and fire means the predator dies. And she showed historical images of prehistoric humans hunting mammoths and Aboriginal Australians using complex fire management and Indigenous Americans conducting coordinated buffalo hunts, and she said, "But here is what makes humans particularly interesting from a Deathworld perspective, and we did not just survive Earth's dangers, and we thrived because of them. And every challenge our planet threw at us made us stronger and more adaptable and more creative. And we spread to every continent and every climate zone and every ecosystem on Earth, and from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, and from coastal regions to high mountain peaks, and from deserts to islands, and there is no environment on Earth where humans cannot survive." And she pulled up a map showing the global distribution of human populations throughout history and said, "We live in regions where temperatures drop to -50 degrees Celsius, and we live in deserts where water is scarce and temperatures exceed 50 degrees, and we live on tiny islands in the middle of massive oceans, subject to typhoons and tsunamis, and we live in earthquake zones and volcanic regions and areas prone to flooding. And we do not just survive because we build civilizations and thrive and multiply." And a Glorian student quivered and said, "But Student Morrison, if your world is so dangerous, why does it appear so pleasant in the initial images? Because Zenthar Prime's dangers are immediately visible. But your world looks inviting." And Kate nodded and said, "That is part of what makes Earth particularly insidious, because it is beautiful. And the same atmospheric systems that create our catastrophic storms also create spectacular sunsets. And the tectonic activity that causes earthquakes also creates majestic mountains. And the competition in our biosphere creates the most diverse and stunning array of life in known space, and Earth is beautiful and abundant and full of resources, but it is also constantly trying to kill you." Kate let her statement about Earth constantly trying to kill its inhabitants hang in the air for a moment, and then she said, "And that constant danger has made humans what we are today, because we do not have exoskeletons or redundant organs like the Zenthari. And we do not have natural weapons or armor, but what we have is adaptability and endurance and a psychological trait that might be our most defining characteristic." And Professor Vexthal's scales shifted to a curious orange color, and she asked, "What trait is that?" Student Morrison and Kate met the professor's compound eyes directly and said, "Stubbornness. Because Earth taught humanity that if something tries to kill you, then you find a way to survive it and understand it, and eventually dominate it. And we do not accept limitations, and when Earth threw disease at us, we invented medicine, and when it threw dangerous predators at us, we invented weapons, and when it threw extreme climates at us, we invented clothing and shelter. And when it threw natural disasters at us, we invented architecture and engineering to withstand them. And she pulled up images of human achievements, showing skyscrapers designed to flex during earthquakes and seawalls protecting against tsunamis, and hurricane-resistant architecture in cities built in deserts with advanced water management, and settlements in the Arctic with sophisticated heating systems. And she said we turned our planet's greatest dangers into advantages, and we studied earthquakes and learned to predict them, and we analyzed storms and developed warning systems, and we examined diseases and created vaccines, and we looked at predators and learned better hunting strategies. And every single thing that tried to kill us became a teacher, and we learned our lessons well. And the lecture hall had fallen completely silent now, and every student was processing what they had just heard. And Professor Vexthal's scales had cycled through several colors, and finally settled on a deep purple that Kate had learned indicated serious consideration, and the professor spoke slowly, saying, "Your presentation is compelling, student Morrison, but the Deathworld classification is not merely about environmental dangers or competitive biospheres, because it is about the physiological adaptations those conditions produce in the dominant species. And the Xanthari possessed demonstrable superior strength and resilience and sensory capabilities compared to standard baseline species, and these adaptations are the true hallmark of a Deathworld species." And Kate had anticipated this response because she had spent the past 3 months studying Xanthari physiology and culture, and she knew that any claim of Earth's Deathworld status would eventually come down to direct comparison, and she said, "I understand, Professor. And would you be willing to conduct a comparative analysis, and nothing that would endanger any participant, of course, but perhaps some practical demonstrations of adaptive capabilities?" And the professor's tail swished in a pattern that Kate recognized as amusement. "And she said you wish to compare human capabilities to Xanthari, and that is quite bold, student Morrison, though I suppose it would be educational for the class to see the differences objectively." And Kate detected a hint of condescension in that statement, but kept her expression neutral and said, "I think it would be very educational." "Yes," and Professor Vexthal made a gesture that brought up a new holographic display, showing a split screen with comparative physiological data, and on the left was a detailed anatomical scan of a Xanthari, and on the right was a baseline galactic standard humanoid for comparison. And the professor said, "Let us begin with the basics, because Xanthari possess 3 times the muscle density of standard species, and our exoskeleton can withstand impacts that would shatter conventional bone structures, and we have redundant respiratory and circulatory systems, and our sensory organs can detect electromagnetic spectrums far beyond standard ranges, and these are measurable and documented facts." And she turned to face Kate directly and said, "I mean, no disrespect to your species, student Morrison, but preliminary scans of human physiology indicate you are, if anything, more fragile than standard baseline species, because you have only 1 heart and 1 set of lungs and relatively thin skin, and a skeletal structure that appears designed more for flexibility than durability. So in what way do these attributes suggest Deathworld adaptation?" And Kate smiled and said, "Would you be willing to run some tests, Professor? And with proper safety protocols, of course, because I think the results might surprise you." And for a long moment Professor Vexthal studied the human standing before her, and this young officer who had challenged centuries of established xenobiological knowledge with calm confidence, and something in Kate's steady gaze made the professor make a decision that would become the subject of xenobiology discussions for years to come. And she said, "Very well, and we shall conduct a series of controlled comparisons, and tomorrow we will meet in the xenobiology practical laboratory, and we will test endurance and strength and sensory capabilities and adaptability, and this will serve as an excellent practical lesson for all students in the proper scientific method for comparative xenobiology." And Kate nodded, hiding her satisfaction, and said, "I look forward to it, Professor." And the lecture ended with the students filing out in excited groups, discussing what they had just witnessed and speculating about the upcoming tests, and word spread quickly throughout Kepler 9 station about the human who claimed to be from a death world and who had challenged the Xanthari professor to prove it. And by the next morning, the xenobiology practical laboratory was packed with far more observers than usual, because students from other departments had found reasons to be present, and even several faculty members had arrived with their curiosity piqued by reports of the upcoming demonstration. and the laboratory was a vast space equipped with adjustable environmental controls and medical monitoring equipment and various testing apparatus designed to safely evaluate the physical capabilities of different species. And Professor Vexthal had set up a series of stations each designed to test a specific aspect of physical adaptation. And Kate arrived wearing standard Earth athletic clothing with flexible pants and a moisture-wicking shirt and running shoes, and compared to Professor Vexthal's impressive crystalline exoskeleton and the elaborate environmental suits worn by many observers, she looked almost comically underprepared, and the professor greeted her formally saying, "Student Morrison, I have prepared a series of tests, but before we begin I must ask if you are certain you wish to proceed because there is no shame in acknowledging the limitations of your physiology, and the Zenthari evolved under extreme conditions over millions of years, and no recently inducted species could be expected to match such adaptations." And Kate appreciated the professor's concern, recognizing it as genuine rather than condescending, and she said, "I appreciate your consideration, Professor, and I am ready to proceed." And Vexthal said, "Very well, and we shall begin with the most basic test, which is atmospheric tolerance," and she gestured to a large chamber with transparent walls and said, "This chamber can simulate various atmospheric compositions and pressures and temperatures, and we will start with conditions matching Zenthar Prime's standard atmosphere, and see how long each of us can comfortably remain within." And the monitor displayed the conditions showing 92% nitrogen and 6% oxygen and 2% trace gases and pressure at 3.2 standard atmospheres, and temperature at 45 degrees Celsius, and Kate examined the readings and nodded, saying that is workable, and several students made sounds of disbelief because those conditions would be fatal to most standard species within minutes. And the Glorian named Glor rippled nervously and said, "Student Morrison, those conditions would cause cellular damage, and the pressure alone would be crushing." And Kate replied, simply saying, "Humans are not standard species, and that is rather the point we are establishing." And Professor Vexthal entered the chamber first, and her movements were easy and natural in conditions that matched her homeworld. And Kate followed, and the door sealed behind them. And medical monitors tracked both participants, vital signs displaying them on screens visible to the observers outside, and the first 10 minutes passed with little change, and Vexthal appeared completely comfortable as expected, and Kate had begun sweating heavily as her body's thermoregulation system worked to cope with the elevated temperature, but her vital signs remained stable, and at 20 minutes Kate was breathing more heavily, and her heart rate had elevated significantly, and several observers began murmuring that the experiment should be stopped. But Kate's vital signs, while elevated, remained within safe parameters, and she was still conscious and functional. At 30 minutes inside the atmospheric chamber, Kate was clearly uncomfortable, and her skin was flushed from the heat, and her breathing was labored from the reduced oxygen partial pressure, but she remained conscious and functional, and she even managed a smile and gave a thumbs-up gesture toward the observation windows. And Professor Vexthal was watching Kate with undisguised fascination, because most baseline species would have lost consciousness by now, and the professor said through the chamber's communication system that this was remarkable because Kate's thermoregulation system was quite efficient, and her body appeared to be compensating for the reduced oxygen through increased respiration and heart rate. And Kate nodded, and did not waste breath on unnecessary words, and said, "Humans evolved at various altitudes, and some populations live at over 4,000 meters elevation, with less oxygen than sea level, and we adapt quickly," and they remained in the chamber for a full hour before Professor Vexthal suggested they conclude the first test. And when they emerged, Kate was drenched in sweat and breathing heavily, but she was steady on her feet and coherent, and the professor said, "You have proven your species has notable tolerance for atmospheric variation, but this is just one measure, and let us move to the next test, which is physical endurance." And she led them to a running track, which was a circular path that could be adjusted for varying gravity levels, and said, "We shall conduct a simple endurance run, and each of us will maintain a steady pace until one of us is unable to continue, and we will run at standard galactic gravity to ensure fairness." And Kate almost laughed, but suppressed it, because standard galactic gravity was approximately 80% of Earth's gravity, and she had spent the past 3 months on Kepler-9, which maintained standard gravity, and she had been feeling lighter and more energetic than she had in her entire life, And she said neutrally, "That seems fair," and they began running at a moderate pace of approximately 10 kilometers per hour. And for the first few kilometers, Professor Vexthal maintained her position easily, and her powerful legs and efficient musculature carried her forward with minimal apparent effort, and Kate settled into a steady rhythm beside her, with controlled and even breathing. And at the 5-kilometer mark, the observers began to notice something interesting, because while Vexthal's pace remained steady, Kate's had not changed at all, and the human's breathing was still regular and her stride was consistent, showing no signs of fatigue. And at 10 kilometers, Vexthal's pace had slowed slightly, and the professor's breathing had increased and her movements were less fluid. But Kate continued at the exact same pace she had started with, and her body was locked into a rhythm that seemed as natural as breathing. And at 15 kilometers, Vexthal's scales had shifted to a darker color and she was clearly beginning to struggle. And Kate, meanwhile, had actually begun humming softly to herself, which was a human habit, that indicated she was still well within her comfort zone. And the professor gasped out a question asking, "How is this possible? Because Xanthari muscles are 3 times as dense as standard species, and we have greater strength than humans. So how do you maintain this pace?" And Kate slowed slightly to match Vexthal's reduced speed out of courtesy and explained, saying, "Different adaptations, Professor. Because humans did not evolve for strength or speed, and we evolved for endurance, and our ancestors would hunt by chasing prey for hours, or sometimes days until it collapsed from exhaustion. And we can run for hours without stopping, and some humans run over 160 kilometers in a single session just for sport. And at 20 kilometers, Professor Vexthal was forced to stop, because her body's oxygen debt was too great to continue. And Kate could have kept going, but she stopped as well out of respect for the conclusion of the test, and the professor took a 30-minute break to recover. And during that time she consumed significant quantities of electrolyte solutions and consulted with her medical monitoring equipment, and Kate used the time to rehydrate and answer questions from curious students, though she was careful not to make any definitive claims until all tests were complete. And when Professor Vexthal had recovered and her scales had returned to their normal coloration, she approached the next testing station, and her demeanor had shifted noticeably, because the casual confidence of the previous day had been replaced by genuine scientific curiosity tempered with something that might have been respect. And she said, "I acknowledge that humans possess remarkable endurance capabilities, but endurance alone does not define a Deathworld species, and let us examine other critical factors like pain tolerance and injury recovery." And she gestured to a medical station equipped with various instruments and said, "This next test will measure our respective species' responses to controlled pain stimuli and our natural healing capabilities. And I must warn you, Student Morrison, that Xanthari have extremely high pain thresholds due to our redundant nervous systems, and this is a necessity for surviving on a world where injury is frequent and often severe." And Kate nodded and asked how they would conduct the test, and the professor explained they would use calibrated neural stimulators to produce measured pain responses, and the intensity would increase gradually until the subject indicated they had reached their tolerance threshold, and following that they would perform minor controlled injuries and monitor healing responses. And a Quelnar medical specialist named Dr. Zix intervened at this point, saying, "Professor Vexthal, I must insist on strict medical oversight for this portion. Because while I find this comparative study fascinating, we cannot risk serious injury to either participant." And Vexthal agreed and asked Dr. Zix to oversee the medical monitoring and said they would proceed cautiously. And the neural stimulator test began conservatively with low-level pain signals that registered as mild discomfort, and both Kate and Vexthal tolerated these easily. And as the intensity increased, the differences between species became apparent, but not in the way most observers expected. Because at moderate pain levels, Vexthal's physiological responses showed significant stress markers with elevated respiration and increased chemical signatures in her bloodstream and visible scale color changes indicating distress. But Kate's responses were more muted and her heart rate increased, but her other vital signs remained relatively stable, and her facial expression, while showing discomfort, remained controlled. And Dr. Zix observed while studying the medical displays that this was interesting because the human appeared to have cognitive pain modulation capabilities, and she was experiencing the pain stimulus but processing it differently than predicted. And Kate gritted her teeth as the intensity increased further, and managed to say that humans have a complex relationship with pain, and we can acknowledge it without letting it completely override our decision-making, and it is another adaptation because on Earth being injured does not mean you are safe, and sometimes you have to keep moving and keep functioning even when hurt. And at high pain levels, both participants reached their voluntary tolerance thresholds within a few percentage points of each other. And Vexthal called an end to her session at intensity level 8.3, and Kate continued to 8.7 before signaling she had reached her comfortable limit, and Professor Vexthal said remarkable because Kate's tolerance was essentially equivalent to Xanthari standards despite lacking redundant nervous systems, and she asked how this was possible. And Kate explained while breathing carefully as she recovered that it was a different strategy with the same result because Vexthal's species evolved multiple pain pathways, so damage to one system does not incapacitate them, but humans evolved the ability to consciously override pain signals when necessary, and both approaches serve the same purpose, which is keeping you functional when injured. And the healing test that followed proved equally revealing, as Dr. Zix performed small, carefully controlled cuts on both participants with Vexthal's arm and Kate's forearm, receiving identical wounds, in depth and length made under sterile conditions with medical-grade instruments, and Vexthal's exoskeleton began secreting a crystalline sealant almost immediately, and her redundant circulatory systems prevented significant blood loss, and the observers nodded because this was well-documented Xanthari physiology. But Kate's wound bled more freely initially, though within seconds her blood began to clot. Dr. Zix moved closer with a scanner and examined Kate's wound with obvious fascination, and announced to the assembled observers that the human blood contained an extremely complex clotting cascade with multiple redundant pathways to ensure hemostasis, and the immune response was already initiating, and white blood cells were mobilizing to the wound site in extraordinary numbers. And over the next hour, with both participants remaining under observation, the healing processes continued, and Vexthal's exoskeleton seal hardened and began the slow process of regeneration from beneath, while Kate's wound formed a scab, and her body's inflammatory response kicked into high gear, fighting potential infection with remarkable efficiency. And Dr. Zix concluded that both species showed excellent healing capabilities with different mechanisms, but comparable results, and the human healing process was actually more aggressive in some ways, with a more active immune response. And Professor Vexthal had been silent during much of this observation, and her scales were cycling through various thoughtful colors, and now she spoke with her voice carrying a note that the translator rendered as something between curiosity and concern, and she said, "Student Morrison, I begin to understand what you meant about Earth being insidiously dangerous because your world produced diseases and parasites severe enough that your species evolved one of the most aggressive immune systems I have encountered, and your predators were dangerous enough that you evolved the ability to function through injuries that would incapacitate most species, and your environment varied enough that you evolved extreme adaptability rather than specialization." And Kate nodded, saying that was correct because humans are not optimized for any one thing the way many species are, and we are optimized for adaptability and persistence, and we might not be the strongest or fastest or toughest in any single category, but we are competitive in almost every category, and that is what Deathworld evolution does because it creates generalists who can handle anything. And a new voice spoke up from the observation area, and Commander Lisa Hayes of the Earth Expeditionary Fleet had arrived during the tests, apparently summoned by other human personnel on the station, who had heard about the demonstrations, and she said, "If I may add something, Professor Vexthal, because Lieutenant Morrison is actually being modest about human capabilities, and what you have observed today is a single human, tested in relatively controlled conditions, and you have not seen what humans can do when we are truly pushed to our limits, or what we are capable of when we work together." And Vexthal turned to face the newcomer, and her scales shifted to an attentive green, and she said, "Please, Commander Hayes, and elaborate because I am finding this entire discussion highly educational, if somewhat disturbing to my previous understanding of xenobiology." And Hayes smiled, but it was not an entirely friendly expression, and she said, "Humans have a stress response we call the fight-or-flight mechanism, and when we perceive serious danger, our bodies flood with adrenaline and other hormones, and this temporarily enhances our strength and speed and pain tolerance and mental processing. And there are documented cases of humans performing what seem like impossible feats under this influence, like lifting vehicles to save trapped individuals, and running on broken bones and surviving injuries that should be fatal, and fighting off predators much larger than themselves. And she pulled up her own datapad, displaying various records, and said, "On Earth, we have humans who voluntarily push themselves to extremes, with athletes who run ultramarathons across deserts and climbers who scale mountains in what we call the death zone, where there is insufficient oxygen for long-term survival, and divers who swim to depths that should crush human bodies, and explorers who survived in environments that should have killed them. And we do these things not because we have to, but because we want to challenge ourselves." And Professor Vexthal said that seems irrational. And Hayes conceded, saying maybe, but it is very human because Earth taught us that limits are meant to be tested and sometimes broken. And it is not always logical, but it has kept us alive and driven us to achieve things that might seem impossible. And the professor was quiet for a long moment, and her scales cycled through several colors before settling on a deep blue that indicated serious contemplation. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that silenced the murmuring observers, and she said, "I believe I owe you an apology, Student Morrison, and by extension your entire species, because I made assumptions based on incomplete data and cultural bias, and the Zenthari have taken pride in our Deathworld heritage for so long that we failed to consider that there might be other paths to the same destination." And she turned to address the full assembly of students and faculty and said, "Let this be a lesson to all of us, because the galaxy is vast and diverse, and our experiences and our evolution and our very understanding of what is possible are all limited by our own perspectives. And the humans have shown us today that Deathworld adaptations can take many forms, and the Zenthari evolved brute resilience and redundant systems, while humans evolved adaptability and persistence, and both approaches are valid responses to extreme evolutionary pressure." And Kate felt a wave of relief mixed with satisfaction, because this was the outcome she had hoped for, and not to diminish the Zenthari's achievements, but to expand the understanding of what Deathworld evolution could produce. And she said, "Thank you, Professor, and I hope this has been educational for everyone, because Earth is very different from Zenthar Prime, but both our worlds pushed our species to evolve beyond normal limits, and that is what makes something a Deathworld, which is not the specific dangers, but the fact that merely living there requires adaptations that go beyond standard biological parameters." And Professor Vexthal agreed, saying, "Indeed." And over the following weeks, Kate's demonstration and the professor's formal recommendation sparked discussions throughout the Galactic Assembly, and scientists from hundreds of worlds requested access to the test data, and medical facilities began updating their understanding of human physiology, and the cultural perception of humanity began to shift in subtle but significant ways, and the formal reclassification of Earth as a death world came. Through 6 standard weeks later, when the Galactic Assembly's Xenobiology Committee, after reviewing all available data and conducting additional tests with other human volunteers, officially designated Earth as a Class 7 death world, which was the same classification as Zenthar Prime, and humanity was no longer seen as a species of pleasant, friendly beings who had lucked into space travel, and they were recognized as a species forged by one of the most insidiously dangerous planets in known space, with adaptations that made them uniquely suited for exploration and persistence and surviving challenges that would break other species. And Kate Morrison continued her studies at Kepler 9, but found herself increasingly consulted on matters of comparative xenobiology, and she and Professor Vexthal co-authored several papers on Deathworld evolution, establishing a framework for understanding how different environmental pressures could produce different adaptive strategies that nonetheless resulted in comparable capabilities. And Commander Hayes and other Earth military personnel found that the new classification affected their standing in joint military operations, and species that had been skeptical of Earth's military capabilities began requesting human participants for difficult missions, and the phrase "send a human" became shorthand in several languages for "send someone who will not give up when things get difficult." And 6 months after Kate had first raised her hand in Professor Vexthal's lecture, she found herself back in that same lecture hall, but this time as a teaching assistant, helping to present a revised course on comparative Deathworld biology, and the class was even more popular now. with waiting lists of students eager to learn about the different paths evolution could take when pushed to extremes, and Professor Vexthal began the lecture with what had become her standard opening saying, "Welcome to Comparative Deathworld Biology, and in this course we will examine the two confirmed Deathworld species in the Galactic Assembly, which are the Xanthari and the humans, and we will explore how Xanthar Prime and Earth, which are two wildly different environments nonetheless both, qualify as Deathworlds and how they shape their respective dominant species." And she gestured to Kate, who stood beside the podium, and said, "My teaching assistant, Lieutenant Morrison, represents a species that teaches us perhaps the most important lesson in xenobiology, which is never assume you fully understand the galaxy, because life finds countless ways to survive and adapt and thrive, and the Xanthari approach and the human approach are both valid and both effective and both worthy of respect and study." And Kate smiled and added, saying, "And remember that just because something looks safe or harmless does not mean it is, because Earth looks like a garden world from space. But it produced humans who are a species that evolved to run prey animals to death and learn to make fire and weapons and spread to every environment on the planet, despite having no natural armor or weapons. And we learned to thrive on a world that was constantly trying to kill us. And we did it by being too stubborn to die." And Professor Vexthal concluded with her scales shifting to an approving blue, saying that is the essence of Deathworld evolution, which is not giving up, and